At 23:40 hours on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll Smith crouched in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at Tacloban Airfield Leyte, watching his radar operator track a contact moving at 200 knots through the black skies over the Philippine Sea. 27 years old, 52 combat missions, 5 confirmed kills. The Japanese had sent 8 bombers to destroy the American supply depots that night. Smith knew what was coming. For 3 weeks, Japanese bombers had attacked Tacloban every night. 287 air raid alerts in 21 days. American engineers were expanding the airfield to support General MacArthur's island-hopping campaign toward Japan. The Japanese understood what Tacloban meant. If American fighters could operate from Leyte, they could cover the entire invasion force moving north. The Japanese had to stop it. They sent bombers every night. Betty bombers, Helen bombers, anything that could carry explosives and make the flight. The 421st Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Tacloban on December 18th, 11 days earlier. Smith's squadron was the only thing standing between those bombers and 15,000 American troops below. The pressure was crushing. Every bomber that got through meant dead supply crews, destroyed fuel dumps, delayed operation, more American casualties in the coming offensives. Smith's mission was simple: stop them all. The P-61 Black Widow was different from anything the Japanese had encountered. The Northrop P-61 was the first American aircraft designed specifically for night combat. 66-foot wingspan, twin Pratt and Whitney R2800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each, top speed 369 mph. But the real weapon wasn't the 420mm cannons mounted in the belly turret. It was the SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose. The radar could detect aircraft up to 6 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea it existed. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible. They were wrong. The radar operator sat behind Smith in a separate compartment, watching a glowing screen that showed every aircraft within range. Lieutenant Robert Graham was Smith's radar operator. He'd been tracking targets for 8 months. He knew how to read the scope, how to vector Smith toward contacts, how to separate friendly aircraft from enemy bombers. The coordination between them was flawless. The problem was mathematics. 1 P-61, 8 Japanese bombers. If Smith engaged one target, 7 others would slip through to bomb the supply depots. The calculation was brutal. Even if Smith shot down 3 bombers, the rest would complete their mission. American casualties would mount. The fuel dumps would burn. The offensive schedule would slip. Smith had trained for this moment for 2 years. Night fighter training at Hammerfield in California. Radar intercept procedures, night navigation, gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was exhaustive because night fighting was the most dangerous form of aerial combat. No visual references, no horizon, just instruments and radar returns, and the hope that the target you were tracking wasn't friendly. The 421st had flown its first combat mission in May 1944, operating from primitive airstrips in New Guinea. The P-61s arrived in September. The Black Widow was everything the earlier night fighters weren't: stable, forgiving, powerful. The radar actually worked, but radar couldn't solve Smith's problem tonight. 8 bombers were coming. His fuel would last maybe 3 hours. If he spent 12 minutes engaging each target, he could only intercept 4 bombers before returning to base. 4 bombers would get through. 4 bombers meant hundreds of casualties. Graham's voice crackled through the intercom at 23:42. He had 3 separate contacts on the scope, all heading south toward Tacloban, all at different altitudes. Smith had to make a choice: which bomber to pursue first, and whether his plan to intercept all 4 in one night was calculated strategy or desperate gamble. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R2800 engines responded instantly. The Black Widow climbed at 2,200 feet per minute. Graham called out vectors: heading 0245, altitude 9,000 feet, range 5 miles. Smith couldn't see anything through the canopy, just blackness. No moon, no stars. Heavy clouds obscured everything. This was why the Japanese chose tonight. Complete darkness meant their bombers were invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose. The dish sent out microwave pulses at 180 degrees forward. When those pulses hit an aircraft, They bounced back. The radar operator's scope showed the return as a glowing blip. The scope had two displays. One showed azimuth, left or right of the aircraft's nose. The other showed elevation, above or below the aircraft. Graham watched both scopes simultaneously. He guided Smith toward the target using verbal correction. Left 8 degrees, down 2 degrees, range 4 miles. Smith activated his own radar scope, a smaller display integrated into the main instrument panel. When the target got close enough, Smith could track it himself. The pilot's scope was simpler than Graham's, just one display showing range and relative position. But it was enough. Once Smith had the target on his scope, he could close for the kill without relying on verbal instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M. The Americans called it Betty. Two 1,530 horsepower Mitsubishi Cussi engines. Maximum speed 272 mph, crew of 7. Bomb load 1,564 pounds. The Betty had a critical weakness. No self-sealing fuel tanks. One burst from Smith's cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range 2 miles. Smith could see the target on his scope now. The blip was steady. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was behind them. Japanese bombers had no tail warning radar. No way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew in darkness, believing they were safe. The P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards. Still couldn't see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied entirely on the radar scope. The blip grew larger as the range decreased. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it. A dark shape against slightly less dark clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible. Faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith moved the P-61 into position. Slightly below the bomber, slightly behind. The four 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage, fixed forward. Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the Mark 8 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel. The gun sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a combining glass. Smith adjusted his position until the bomber sat centered in the reticle. Range 400 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds, 800 rounds total, enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night Fighter doctrine called for short, concentrated bursts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill, move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds for the remaining targets. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. The four cannons fired in unison. The sound was deafening, even through the engine noise. 20mm high explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers looked like red lines drawn across the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds, 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. The burning aircraft illuminated the clouds below. It hit the water 6 miles east of Tacloban at 23:59. One bomber down, 7 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned through 18% of his fuel, and 2 more contacts were still on Graham's scope, all heading toward the supply depots, all separated by miles of black sky, and Smith had exactly 124 minutes of fuel remaining. Think about it for a moment. You're alone in the dark, multiple threats closing in, resources running low, every decision matters. Have you ever faced a moment where everything depended on your next move? If that kind of pressure speaks to you, you're in the right place with WW2 Shadow Tales. Graham identified the second target at 0216 on December 30th. Heading 175, altitude 7,000 feet, range 7 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The problem was geometry. The second bomber was 26 miles from the first kill. Smith's P-61 cruised at 219 mph. That meant roughly 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Tacloban, closer to the supply depots, closer to completing its mission. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster. 304 Prehway. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at top maximum speed cost him 4 minutes of patrol time. But if he didn't intercept the bomber quickly, it would reach the target zone. American anti-aircraft gunners would open fire. The bomber might get shot down, or it might release its bombs. Either way, Smith would have failed. The mathematics of night interception were brutal. Most night fighter missions ended without contact. The sky was enormous. Even with radar, finding a single bomber required perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Finding 4 bombers in one night was nearly impossible. The 421st Night Fighter Squadron had scored 23 kills total since arriving in the Pacific Theater. 23 kills in 7 months. Smith already had 5 kills to his name. Adding 4 more in one night would make him one of the top American night fighter aces of the war. But records didn't matter. What mattered was stopping those bombers. Graham called out corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact grew stronger on the radar scope. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile, same vulnerable fuel tanks. The bomber was lower than the first one. 7,000 feet instead of 9,000. Closer to the cloud layer. That gave Smith less room to maneuver. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters relied on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. Bomber crews would take evasive action. Gunners would open fire. The clean intercept would turn into a dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's black paint made it nearly invisible at night. The engines were quiet compared to most fighters. The Japanese feared the Black Widow, but fear only worked if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range 350 yards. He fired. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately. Then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at Zolwajo Tuatu, 22 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down, 6 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 38% remaining. Graham had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Tacloban than the previous targets. Both were at different altitude, one at 10,000 feet, one at 5,000 feet. They were 9 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than descending rapidly, but the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the supply depots. If Smith made the wrong choice, one bomber would get through, and the entire mission would be considered a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 10,000 feet at 0.26. Graham locked onto the third contact. Range 8 miles, heading 165, speed 195 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys, and it was taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew the Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu. The Americans called it Helen. Faster than the Betty. Maximum speed, 306 impulse. Better defensive armament, 5 7.7mm machine guns. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left. The bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers. Turning left, then right, climbing 300 feet, descending 400. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Graham compensated by predicting the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot made a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. At 325 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streamed past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, longer than his previous attacks, necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. It hit the water at 0-31. 31 minutes after midnight, 3 bombers down, 5 remaining, but Smith's fuel gauge showed 24%, critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 25% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing. Or worse, running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Graham had one more contact on his scope, the 4th target, heading 180, altitude 5,000 feet, range 10 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 14 miles from Tacloban, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfield, thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the 4th bomber. Diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000, 6,000. Smith leveled off at 5,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react, range 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Tacloban. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area, or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill. Below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter, 632 rounds remaining, enough for 4 more attacks, maybe 5 if he was conservative, but this was the 4th target. He needed to make every shot count. Smith's fuel gauge showed 19%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. One chance, one burst, then he had to return to base. Whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying, Smith fired at 0-38's 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0-39, 39 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 59 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Tacloban. His fuel gauge showed 17%. The mathematical calculation was simple. Tacloban airfield was 22 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 95 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 55 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 35 minutes. More than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Graham scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 4 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The supply depots were safe. Operations would continue without interruption. The offensive schedule remained intact. Intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. 4 bombers, all exactly where Smith reported. 4 kills in one night equaled the highest single night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater at that time. The 421st night. Fighter Squadron continued operations from Tacloban through March 1945. The unit scored 38 total kills during the war. Smith's 9 total kills accounted for nearly 24% of the squadron's score. Graham received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. His skill made every intercept possible. Night fighting was a team effort, pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 706 aircraft built, used in every theatre: European, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1952, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was one of the best pilots flying it. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in August 1945, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives: unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. Tacloban Airfield supported MacArthur's island-hopping campaign as planned. American forces continued pushing north toward Japan. P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs operating from Leyte provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29th enabled that air cover. Japanese bombs hitting the supply depots would have delayed operations by weeks. Delayed operations meant delayed offensives, more American casualties. The war would have lasted longer. 4 bombers stopped in 59 minutes, 4 crews that never completed their mission. 15,000 American troops who slept safely that night. Supply depots that remained intact. Operations that continued on schedule, all because one P-61 Black Widow and its 2-man crew hunted in the darkness with technology the enemy didn't know existed. These men deserve to be remembered. Carroll Smith, Robert Graham, the ground crews who maintained the P-61s, the intelligence officers who confirmed the kills, the radar technicians who kept the SCR-720 systems operational. All of them contributed to missions that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. Their names aren't in history books, their stories aren't taught in schools, but their actions mattered. They saved lives, they enabled victories, they made history.